Well, the events that led to Calvin entering Geneva in 1536 were nothing short of providential. Calvin had no intentions of being a pastor. He was a young, up-and-coming theological scholar of the day. In fact, when he was barely 27 years old, he published the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536. That was the very year that he ended up going to Geneva for his first stint as pastor in that city. But Calvin initially fled his native France due to obviously religious persecution. A warrant was essentially out for Calvin's life, and so Calvin fled his native France, and he actually dedicated the first edition of the Institutes to King Francis I. And if you read the preface to the Institutes, which is basically his letter to the king, he's pleading with King Francis to tolerate Protestants, to stop killing them, to stop persecuting them. Calvin really wanted to return to France eventually, but he understood he had to flee at this moment, and so he fled. And he was on his way to Strasbourg. Strasbourg seemed like a good town. There were a lot of reformers there. It could be a place where he could sort of retire with his books and study and write theologically. And he wanted to sort of stay away from the trenches of the Reformation. Calvin wanted to sort of live in an ivory theological tower and write great theological works and help the Reformation that way. He ended up in Geneva just by God's providence. King Francis was in a war, and some of the roads were closed on his way to Strasbourg, and so he, along with some other friends, had to pass through Geneva. And so they entered Geneva, and they intended the next morning to leave and head to Strasbourg and continue with his theological studies and writing. But William Farel got wind that John Calvin was in town, the John Calvin, the writer of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. And Farel had been in Geneva for some months, and he had preached. He had actually convinced the town council to send the Catholic priests into exile. And William Farel actually had the pulpit at St. Pierre's Cathedral, and he was preaching sermons from that pulpit. But Farel was more of a preacher, less of an organizer. He wasn't great with administrative skills. And so he saw Calvin as sort of this organizer of theological truth as he read the Institutes, as the perfect person. I mean, how could it get any better than this, that John Calvin would be in Geneva? So he went to see John Calvin, unannounced, uninvited, obviously. And he began to plead with Calvin that the work of the Reformation in Geneva was an important work, that Geneva had the opportunity to be the model city of the Reformation. What could the Reformation do to a city? What could the gospel do for a whole city? And so he pitched this to John Calvin, and John Calvin basically told William Farel that he was prone to shyness, he was bashful by nature, he was more of a theologian, he wasn't cut out for pastoral work, he didn't want to be in the limelight of the Reformation. And William Farel would just have none of this. This is one of my favorite stories of church history. William Farel told him that God would curse his studies if he left Geneva and didn't help him with the Reformation and went to Strasbourg. Well, Calvin, being the sensitive fellow that he was, and he was sensitive to the leading and moving of God in his life, saw this curse on his studies as a warning from God himself. And